Harold Hart didn't look at his daughter when he said it. He looked at the cattle. 36 of them, standing in the morning dust outside the Ridge County Land Office, their breath fogging in the cold air. He counted each one twice, his lips moving like a man at prayer. Then he nodded, slow and satisfied, and reached across the table to shake Silas Boone's hand. "She'll be ready by Friday," Harold said. Evelyn stood 3 feet away. She heard every word. She was 19 years old, and her father had just traded her. Traded her the way you trade a lame horse or a broken plow for livestock. Not for her future. Not for her safety. For 36 head of cattle and the cancellation of a gambling debt that he'd spent 6 months pretending didn't exist. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at the back of her father's head and felt something go very quiet inside her chest, like a door closing softly on a room she would never enter again. And if you think you know how this story ends, I promise you, you don't. Tempt. If you've ever been told you weren't worth much, stay with me until the end of this story. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Harold Hart made the worst, or perhaps the most revealing, decision of his life, Evelyn had been awake since 4 o'clock. She'd been awake because someone had to be. The bread wouldn't proof itself, and the fire had gone cold in the night, and her younger brother Clem had left the water bucket sitting empty on the porch again. None of these things surprised her. She moved through the dark kitchen the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, without expecting thanks, because that was the architecture of her life. She was the one who kept things running. She just wasn't the one who got credit for it. By the time her father came downstairs, the kitchen was warm, coffee was hot, and Evelyn was kneading dough with her hands white to the wrist. Harold Hart walked past her without a word, poured himself a cup, and stood at the window looking out at a sky going gray and pink at the edges. "I need you dressed decent this morning," he said, still looking at the window. "We're going into town." Evelyn didn't stop kneading. "What for?" "Business." That was the whole of it. That was the warning she got. She wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much. Blue calico that had been washed so many times the color had faded to something closer to the sky on an overcast day. She'd let the hem out twice already, and even then it sat an inch higher than was proper. Evelyn Hart was tall for a woman, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been work-roughened since she was 10 years old. She wasn't ugly. She wasn't anything the town of Blackstone Ridge would call pretty, either. She existed somewhere in between, in the territory where women stopped being looked at and started being looked past. She was used to it. She walked beside her father into town that morning and noticed vaguely that he wasn't talking to her, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way he was walking, fast, forward-leaning, with the energy of a man who had settled something in his mind and didn't want anything to knock it loose before he could act on it. The land office sat on the main street between the feed store and the telegraph office. When her father pushed through the door, Evelyn followed out of simple reflex. There was a man already inside, sitting in the wooden chair across from the clerk's desk with his hat on his knee. He stood when Harold came in, and they shook hands like men who had already spoken. Like this meeting was the conclusion of something, not the beginning. His name was Silas Boone. Evelyn had heard of him. Everyone in Blackstone Ridge had heard of him, the way everyone heard of any man with 5 children and a dead wife and a ranch that the drought had been slowly strangling for 2 years. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, maybe 37, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes so dark they looked almost black in the low light of the office. He was not a small man. He was not a soft one either. He stood in a room the way a fence post stands in the ground, not because it's trying, but because it doesn't know how to do anything else. He looked at her once, just once. A measuring look, not unkind, but not warm. The look of a man assessing whether something is going to be useful. Then he looked away. The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. Evelyn stood near the wall while her father and Silas Boone spoke in low, even voices at the clerk's desk. The cattle count, the date of transfer, the terms of the agreement. She caught fragments. 36 head. Friday noon. The Boone Ranch. A legal document, signed and witnessed, transferring. Transferring what, exactly? Her? The obligation of her? She wasn't quite sure what the paper said. She didn't get to read it. When Harold turned around and finally looked at her, something in his face shifted. Not regret. It wasn't regret. It was closer to discomfort. The look of a man who'd done something he was going to stop thinking about as quickly as possible. "Evelyn," he said, "you're going to marry Silas Boone. You'll go to his ranch Friday." She stood very still. "You traded me," she said. Her voice came out flat, which surprised her. She'd expected it to shake. Harold's jaw tightened. "I made a practical arrangement. You were never going to get a better offer." The words landed exactly where he'd intended them to land. She could see it in the small, quick flicker of his eyes, checking to see if they'd cut. They had. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching her bleed from them. She turned to look at Silas Boone. He was watching her now. Really watching her, not just assessing. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not guilt. Maybe something closer to acknowledgement. "Mr. Boone," she said, "do you want a wife, or do you want someone to keep your house?" The room went so quiet she could hear the clerk's pen scratch to a stop. Silas Boone held her gaze. "I've got 5 children and a ranch and not enough hours in the day," he said. "I suppose I want both." She nodded, once. "I'll be ready Friday." She walked out of the land office ahead of her father, and she did not look back. The next 3 days were the loneliest of her life, which was remarkable because the competition was fierce. She didn't tell her mother. Her mother would cry and flutter and make everything worse without actually changing a single thing. She told no one. She packed what she had, which was very little. 2 dresses, a wool coat, her grandmother's sewing kit, the recipe card she'd written out in her own hand over the years because no one had ever thought to give her a cookbook. She packed them all into a single canvas bag and set it by the door of her room, and then sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and tried to understand what her life was going to look like after Friday. She came up empty. There was a particular cruelty in not knowing. She'd heard things about the Boone children. Everyone had. The oldest was a boy named Caleb, 14 years old, who the school teacher had given up on 2 years ago. Then twin girls, Ida and May, 10 years old, who ran in a pack and rarely spoke to adults. Then a boy named Theodore, who everyone called Teddy, 7, who was known to be the quiet one. And the youngest, a girl named Rosie, barely 4 years old, who someone in town had described as that poor baby who hasn't known a settled home in a year. 5 children. No mother. A dying ranch. And a man who had agreed to take a stranger as a wife in exchange for livestock. Evelyn lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, well, she'd been handed worse problems than this. She'd just never been handed them all at once. And Friday came cold and gray, with the kind of flat sky that promises nothing good, but doesn't threaten anything terrible either. Harold drove her to the edge of his property in the wagon without speaking, and Silas Boone met them at the fence line with a buckboard and a nod. There was no ceremony. There would be a formal record in the county books that her father had made sure of that for his own protection more than anything else. But there was no preacher, no witnesses, no flowers. Evelyn climbed from one wagon to another. Her father didn't say goodbye. He was already turning the horse around before she'd settled her bag at her feet. Silas clicked the horse into motion without a word, and they rode for 11 miles without talking. The land changed around them. Flatter, drier, the grass browner than it should have been for the season. She noticed the dry creek beds. She noticed the way the fence posts along the road had started to lean without anyone straightening them. When the Boone Ranch came into view, she took a quiet breath. The house was a 2-story structure that had probably been solid once. Now it wore the look of a building that had been surviving rather than living. The paint nearly gone, the porch railing missing 2 boards, the yard between the house and the barn occupied by rusted equipment and what appeared to be the remains of a wagon someone had started to repair and then abandoned. 3 of the 5 children were standing in the yard. She could feel them looking at her. She looked back. Caleb Boone, at 14, had his father's posture without his father's stillness. He stood in the yard with his arms crossed and his chin slightly lifted, the stance of a boy who had decided something about her before she'd even stepped down from the buckboard. His eyes moved over her once, deliberately, and then he turned and walked into the barn without a word. The twins, Ida and May, were identical in every way except their expressions. Ida looked suspicious. May looked simply curious. They stood side by side in matching flour sack dresses and watched Evelyn with the particular intensity of children who've learned that watching closely gives you an advantage. Teddy hung back near the porch steps, half hidden behind the post. She'd heard he was the quiet one. Looking at him now, she thought, no, not quiet. Careful. There was a difference. Rosie wasn't in the yard. She found out later that the little girl had been told a new woman was coming to live in the house and had hidden under the kitchen table and refused to come out. Silas got down from the buckboard and said, "Evelyn, this is—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I'll let you make your own introductions." She appreciated that more than she would have been able to explain. She stepped down from the wagon with her canvas bag over her shoulder and walked toward the children. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "I'm not here to take your mother's place. I couldn't do that even if I tried. I'm here to help with the cooking and the house and whatever else needs doing." She looked at Ida, then May, then the space where Teddy was trying to disappear. "I'm going to need help learning where things are. If you feel like it, I'd be grateful. If you don't, I'll figure it out on my own." Silence. Then May said without any particular malice, "You're big." "May," said Silas, voice low. "She is," May said, unruffled. "It's true." Evelyn looked at her. "I am," she said. "Comes in useful sometimes." May blinked. This was apparently not the response she'd expected. "None." The kitchen was the worst room in the house. Not because it was dirty. It was messier than she liked, but that was fixable. It was the state of the supplies that told the real story. Half a sack of flour, mostly full, but with a thin line of weevil tracks at the bottom. Salt pork, a little. Some dried beans. 3 potatoes that were more ambition than food at this point. A crock of lard that someone had been careful with, which told her there wasn't much else for cooking. She stood in the middle of it for a while. She'd made meals out of less, but not for 7 people. She'd found Rosie under the kitchen table when she came in, a small, dark-haired child with her father's eyes and her arms wrapped around her own knees, watching Evelyn from the shadow with a combination of fear and defiance that was almost heartbreaking on a 4-year-old face. Evelyn crouched down until she was at eye level with the table. "Hello?" she said. Rosie said nothing. "I'm going to make supper in a little while. I could use someone to hand me things." The child stared at her. "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "Just letting you know the option exists." She straightened up and turned to the stove and started sorting through what was there, and within 3 minutes she heard, very quietly, the sound of small feet on the floorboards as Rosie crawled out from under the table to see what she was doing. She didn't acknowledge it. She just kept working. The meal that came out of that near-empty kitchen was bean soup with salt pork and cornbread. Not remarkable, not plentiful, but warm and real, and made without a single complaint. She put it on the table at 6 o'clock and called the children. They came, eventually. Even Caleb, though he sat at the far end of the table with the expression of someone enduring an insult. She'd found a jar of dried apple rings at the back of the pantry shelf and sliced them thin and put them in a bowl in the center of the table. Not a dessert exactly, just something sweet, just something that said, "I noticed you." Rosie ate everything on her plate. That was the first good thing. The first act of war came the next morning. She woke before dawn, as usual, and came downstairs to find that someone had knocked the flour sack from the shelf in the night. It had split at the seam and spread across the kitchen floor. A full foot of white powder, the weevil-free portion they couldn't afford to waste, now mixed with grit and dirt from the boards. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at it. She was almost certain it hadn't fallen. The sack had been folded at the top and set squarely on the shelf, and there was no reason it should have fallen, and if she looked at it honestly, the angle of the split suggested it had been dropped, not tipped. She looked at the flour. She looked at the closed door to the children's rooms upstairs. Then she got the broom. She swept as much of it as she could back into the sack, a small amount, a heartbreaking amount, and sifted what she could save. She made breakfast from what remained without saying one word about it to anyone. Caleb came down last, with the careful blankness of a boy waiting to be accused. She set a plate in front of him. Eggs, thin but real, a piece of bread. "Thank you," she said. He blinked. "For not doing it to the salt pork," she said. "We'd really be in trouble then." He stared at her. She thought she saw something flicker at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something pulled back fast before it became one. She turned back to the stove. She had won nothing. She knew that. But she had not lost either, and for the first morning on a stranger's failing ranch with a family that had already decided to hate her, she thought, that was enough. That was enough for now. The second act of war came 3 days after the flower. Evelyn had spent those 3 days doing what she always did when she didn't know what else to do. She worked. She worked the way water works on stone, not with violence, but with persistence, showing up in the same place at the same time every day until something gave. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. She rehung the porch railing board that had been loose since before she arrived. She found a needle and thread in her grandmother's sewing kit and repaired the split seam in Teddy's only good shirt while he was sleeping, leaving it folded on the chair outside his door without a note. She didn't want credit. She wanted function. There was a difference. Silas watched her. She could feel it, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way a man watches something he can't quite categorize yet. He wasn't cold with her. He wasn't warm either. He was careful, the way a man is careful when he's made a decision he's not entirely sure about and doesn't yet know if he needs to defend it or apologize for it. He said good morning. He said thank you at supper. He told her, once, that the fence on the south pasture needed mending and he'd get to it when he could. As if she'd asked, she hadn't. As if he felt the need to explain the state of his own ranch to her. She didn't tell him the fence wasn't the most urgent thing. She let him figure that out in his own time. The second act of war was simpler than the flower, more personal. She'd left her grandmother's sewing kit on the kitchen table overnight, a small cedar box worn smooth with a brass clasp that had been repaired twice with wire. When she came down in the morning, it was gone. She checked every surface in the kitchen. She checked the parlor. She went upstairs and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the particular silence of children pretending to be asleep, and then she went back downstairs and made breakfast. At the table, May watched her with the expression of a child waiting for an explosion. Evelyn put the food down and sat, and said, conversationally, to no one in particular, "My grandmother gave me that sewing kit when I was 7. She died the winter after. It's the only thing of hers I have left." She picked up her fork. "So whoever has it, I'd like it back. No questions." Breakfast was eaten in silence. When she came back to the kitchen after hanging the washing, the cedar box was sitting in the center of the table. The brass clasp was still intact. Nothing inside had been touched. She stood there for a moment. Then she put it back on the shelf where it belonged and went back to work. That evening, May appeared in the kitchen doorway while Evelyn was cooking supper. She stood there long enough that Evelyn looked up. "My mother had a sewing box too," May said. Her voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. "Ida took it." "Where is it now?" May's mouth pressed together. "Pa put it in the trunk upstairs, with her other things." Evelyn nodded and looked back at the pot she was stirring. "That's where it should be." May lingered another moment. "I'm the one who took yours," she said. "I wanted to see if it was nicer than hers." "Is it?" "No." "Good," Evelyn said. She kept stirring. "Your mother's things should be nicer." She heard May exhale. Not quite a sigh, not quite a release of something. Then footsteps going back upstairs. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't friendship, but it was the first real thing that had passed between them, and Evelyn carried it through the rest of that evening like a small coal in her chest, careful not to knock it out. The thing about the Boone Ranch was that it wasn't dying from neglect alone. Evelyn understood that within the first week. Neglect was part of it. A man with 5 children and grief in his spine and a drought sucking the water out of the land didn't have enough hours in the day to manage everything that needed managing. But there was something else underneath the neglect, something that she couldn't name yet, something that had to do with the way the neighboring ranches sat silent on the horizon, the way the men in town went quiet when Silas's name came up, the way even the feed store clerk looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity. She filed that observation away. She had learned a long time ago that things you couldn't name yet were often the most important things. What she could deal with immediately was the water situation. The well behind the house was pulling up water that tasted wrong. Not dangerous wrong, not yet, but off. Brackish in a way it shouldn't have been. She mentioned it to Silas one evening after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "The well water's gone funny," she said. He looked up from the ledger he'd been staring at without appearing to actually read it. "I know." "How long?" 4 or 5 months. He set down his pencil. "It started around the same time as the Murchison place. They had the same problem. Theirs got worse." "What happened to the Murchison place?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "They sold. They moved east. Gideon Ashcroft bought the land for about a quarter what it was worth." She let that sit. "You think there's a connection?" "I think I can't prove anything," he said, and the way he said it told her he'd thought about it hard, more than once, in the way you think about something that scares you. She didn't push. She said, "We should start collecting rainwater. I'll set up barrels along the roofline." He blinked. Yeah, that would help." It was the first time he'd looked at her with something other than careful neutrality. It was brief, but it was there. Caleb broke first, and he did it in the worst possible way. Evelyn had been at the ranch 9 days when it happened. She'd ridden into Blackstone Ridge with Silas to collect supplies, her first time in town since the land office, and she felt the looks immediately. Women on the boardwalk who tracked her passage with their eyes without moving their heads. Men at the feed store who spoke to Silas in lowered voices and pretended she wasn't standing 2 feet away. She bought what was on the list and kept her chin level and her expression pleasant, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But when she came back, she found Caleb in the kitchen. He wasn't doing anything wrong, exactly. He was sitting at the table with a bowl and a spoon and the sack of dried beans she'd been carefully rationing, and he'd eaten, she counted later, about a third of what she'd allocated to last them another week and a half. He looked up when she came in. He knew. She could see that he knew. His jaw was set in a way that said he'd done it on purpose, was ready for the fight, had in fact probably been sitting there waiting for her to come home so he could have it. She put down her basket. She looked at the bowl. She looked at him. "Hungry?" she said. "So what if I am?" "Nothing. You're a growing boy. You should eat." She started unpacking the basket. "I just need to know so I can plan the week's meals different." He stared at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "You're not going to yell at me? For being hungry? For—" He stopped. His hands went flat on the table. "I ate more than I was supposed to." "I know. I can count." She put the flour away and turned to face him properly. "Caleb, I am not your mother. I can't be, and I won't pretend to be. But I'm here, and the food situation on this ranch is not great. And if you eat through the weekly rations in a single afternoon because you're angry at me, everyone goes to bed hungry, including Rosie." Something moved across his face. It was the first crack she'd seen in his armor, and it appeared and was sealed again so fast she almost missed it. "I'm not angry at you," he said, but he said it to the table. "You're angry at the situation," she said. "That's fair. The situation is terrible." He was quiet. Then, "My dad didn't have to. He didn't have to do it like this." She sat down across from him. This was not a time for standing. "No," she said. "He didn't." "So why did you come?" She thought about lying, about softening it. She thought about the alternatives available to a 19-year-old girl in a town like Blackstone Ridge, with a father like Harold Hart. Because the options were limited, she said, and because you can't change the options you're given, only what you do with them. He absorbed that. "You don't seem scared." "I'm scared all the time," she said. I'm just not going to let it make my decisions." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he'd been avoiding since she arrived. He wasn't soft about it. He was still 14, still prickly, still carrying more weight in those shoulders than a boy should carry. But he looked. "The beans were good," he said finally. She almost smiled. Almost. "There's a trick to soaking them, right? I'll show you sometime if you want." He shrugged, which was not a yes, but was not a no either, and she decided that was progress enough for one afternoon. The journals were Rosie's fault, in the best possible way. It was the end of the second week. The little girl had attached herself to Evelyn in the particular way that very small children attach to people they've decided are safe. Not with words, not with declarations, but with proximity. She appeared at Evelyn's elbow while she was working. She sat on the kitchen floor with her rag doll while Evelyn cooked. She fell asleep on the parlor settle one afternoon while Evelyn was mending and woke up with the shape of a blanket crease on her cheek. And when Evelyn asked how she'd slept, she held up one finger and said, "This many, good." She was 4 years old and her vocabulary was patchy, and she had her father's eyes and her dead mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking, which Evelyn only knew because she'd seen Silas describe it once to Teddy without realizing she was within earshot. It was Rosie who led her to the room. The door at the end of the upstairs hall was always closed. Evelyn had assumed it was Silas's room and had been careful never to approach it without reason. But one afternoon Rosie took her by the hand and pulled her upstairs and pointed at that door with a kind of urgent seriousness. "Mama's room," she said. Evelyn stopped. "Rosie, sweetheart, I don't think we should—" "Books," Rosie said. She mimed opening something with both hands. "Mama's books." Evelyn stood in the hallway for a long moment. She thought about Silas at the table with his ledger. She thought about the water that tasted wrong and the Murchison Ranch sold for a quarter of its value. She turned the handle. The room was cold. It had the smell of a place that had been sealed against something. Not rot, nothing that dramatic, just the held breath smell of stopped time. There was a bed, neatly made, with a quilt that someone had folded and placed with care. There was a writing desk against the wall. On the desk was a stack of journals, 7 of them. Black covers, cloth-bound, the pages swollen slightly with time. The name written on the inside cover of the top one, in neat and careful script, was Clara Boone. Evelyn sat down in the desk chair. Her hands rested on her knees for a moment. Then she opened the first journal and started reading. Clara Boone had been, from the evidence of her own handwriting, a precise and observant woman. The early journals were domestic, records of the ranch's output, the children's milestones, the weather, and its effects on the pasture. There was warmth in the entries, but they weren't sentimental. They were the records of a practical woman who loved her family and also understood that love without information was useless. Evelyn read for an hour before she found the first entry that made her go still. It was dated 14 months before Clara's death. The handwriting was the same, precise, controlled, but there was something tighter in it, something held. Silas won't hear of it, but I know what I saw. The North Creek ran clean last spring. This spring it doesn't. I collected samples in jars the way my father taught me, and the sediment is wrong. Not natural wrong, changed wrong. Somebody is doing something to that water upstream. I have to find out who and where before I say more. Evelyn turned the page. I asked Lena Murchison if she'd noticed. She went quiet in a way that told me yes. She said Ray told her not to talk about it. I asked why, and she looked at me like I'd asked her to step in front of a moving wagon. Another page. The Halverson boys found a dead section of their north fence last week. Posts pulled, wire cut. Someone walked cattle through. Not theirs. Branded A inside a circle. That's Ashcroft's brand. I've seen it at the stockyards. Evelyn turned the pages faster. Clara had been careful. She'd been meticulous, actually, recording dates and locations, describing what she'd observed in plain language, cross-referencing entries. She had a scientist's mind and a rancher's wife's circumstances, and she had been building something, a case, a record. And then 6 months before she died, there was this. A man came to the house today while Silas was in the far pasture. He didn't give his name. He said he was passing through, but a man passing through doesn't come to your front door and ask if your husband is home. He said people who make trouble for Gideon Ashcroft find that trouble has a way of coming back to them. He said he hoped Clara and the children were staying healthy. Then he tipped his hat and left. I wrote this down because I am afraid, and I want someone to know why, if something happens. The last journal entry was written 3 months before Clara Boone died, of what everyone in Blackstone Ridge had been told was a fever. Evelyn closed the journal. She sat in the cold room with the stack of books in her hands, and she felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but was in the territory between the two. The particular feeling of understanding that something is very wrong and has been wrong for a long time, and the people who should have stopped it either couldn't or didn't. She thought about the water in the well. She thought about the Murchison place sold for a quarter of its worth. She thought about the look on Silas's face when he said, "I can't prove anything." She sat there for a long time. She waited until that night, after the children were in bed, before she went to Silas. He was in the barn. She'd learned that he went to the barn when he couldn't sleep, which seemed to be often. She found him checking the leg wrapping on one of the mares with a lamp hung on the post beside him, and when she appeared in the doorway with the stack of journals in her arms, he stood up slowly. The look on his face told her he knew what she was carrying. "You found them," he said. "Rosie showed me the room." He let out a breath. He leaned against the post and looked at the journals the way a man looks at something he's been trying to avoid for a long time. I couldn't read them after she passed. I knew she'd been keeping them, but I couldn't. Silas, she kept her voice even, I think you need to read them. Evelyn, I think Clara knew what was happening to the water. I think she knew it was Ashcroft. She paused. And I think she was warned to stop looking into it. And I think she kept looking anyway. And I think you need to consider what that means about how she died. The silence in the barn was absolute. The mare shifted. The lamp swayed slightly in a draft from the open door. Silas Boone looked at the journals in her arms with an expression she had never seen on him before. A cracking open look, like the face of a man who has been standing very still for a very long time and has just been asked to move. You're saying someone... He stopped. His voice had gone rough. I'm saying Clara thought so. I'm saying her evidence is in here. She held the journals out to him. And I'm saying the same thing is happening to our well right now. He took the journals. His hands weren't entirely steady. They stood in the barn with the lamp throwing shadows and the horses breathing soft in their stalls. And neither of them spoke for a long time. He was reading, or trying to. She could see his eyes moving across the pages. And she watched his jaw tighten with each entry and thought about all the things that had happened on this ranch and in this valley that had been allowed to happen because no one had put it all in one place. Clara had put it in one place. She was braver than me, Silas said, very quietly. He wasn't talking to Evelyn. He was talking to the journal. She loved her family, Evelyn said. That's not the same as brave. It just looks like it from the outside. He looked up at her. It was one of those moments she would think about later. Not because anything dramatic happened in it, not because anything was said or decided, but because it was the first moment in which she understood that Silas Boone was looking at her and actually seeing her, not assessing her usefulness, not measuring the transaction, seeing her. What do we do? He said. First you finish reading, she said. All of it. Tonight if you can. Then we figure out what she found and what we can still prove. He nodded. She turned to go back to the house. She'd reached the barn door when he said her name. Evelyn, she stopped. I'm sorry, he said, for how this started. She stood in the doorway for a moment, with the night air coming in cold against her face. Read the journals, she said, then we'll talk. She went back to the house and checked on the children. Rosie's blanket had slipped. She tucked it back. And then she sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while with her hands folded on the table, thinking about a woman she'd never met who'd been careful enough to write everything down. She thought, Clara Boone had known something was coming and she'd kept going anyway. Evelyn was going to make sure that counted for something. Mas. The next morning she woke to find Silas already at the kitchen table. The lamp had burned low. He'd been there all night. All 7 journals were closed and stacked neatly in front of him, and he was sitting with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. She put water on for coffee without speaking. When she set the cup down in front of him, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. He'd passed through whatever had needed to be passed through. "There's a federal marshal comes through Mill Haven every 6 weeks for the circuit court," he said. "Due through again in about 2 weeks. That's our best option. Ashcroft has the county sheriff in his pocket. Everyone knows it. Then we go above the county sheriff." He looked at her. "If he finds out we're building a case against him, I know. He has men. He has money. He has... Evelyn, he's been doing this for years. The Halverson boys, the Murchisons, people who crossed him found that things got worse for them fast." "I know," she said again. He stared at her. "You're not scared." She thought about telling him what she'd told Caleb, because it was still true. She said it slightly differently this time. Being scared doesn't change what's right. It just makes it harder to do it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the coffee and drank. Outside, the sky was going pink and pale at the edges. In the rooms above, she could hear the sounds of the children beginning to stir. Rosie's feet on the floor, Teddy's voice asking something she couldn't make out, May responding sharply, which was May's way. The ranch was waking up. There was work to do. But underneath the work now, underneath the cooking and the mending and the careful rationing of dried beans, something else was moving. Something with edges and weight. Something that Clara Boone had started and no one had finished. And Evelyn felt it settle into her the way a second load settles onto a yoke. Heavy, real, and hers now whether she'd chosen it or not. She went to start breakfast. And she did not look behind her. The days that followed were a particular kind of tense. The kind where everything on the surface looks ordinary and underneath it something is pulling tight like a wire being wound too far. Evelyn and Silas had made an unspoken agreement not to discuss the journals in front of the children. This was harder than it sounded, because children who have survived difficult years develop a finely calibrated instinct for adult concealment, and the Boone children were no exception. Caleb watched them at supper with the sharp eyes of a boy who knew something had shifted. May asked once why her father had been in the barn all night, and Silas said he'd been checking on the mare, and May looked at him with the flat expression of a child who has been lied to enough times to recognize the texture of it. But she let it go. Even Teddy, who rarely initiated anything, appeared in the kitchen doorway one afternoon while Evelyn was making notes in the back of the household ledger. Careful, coded notes. Cross-referencing Clara's journal dates against the timeline of ranch failures in the valley, and stood there long enough that she closed the book before turning around. "You need something, Teddy?" He shook his head, then, "Is something bad going to happen?" She looked at him. He was 7 years old, with his mother's journal-writing precision already showing up in the way he arranged his thoughts before he spoke. "I don't know," she said, because he was the kind of child that a straight answer respected more than a comfortable one. "But your father and I are working on something, okay?" He nodded, once, and went back upstairs. She sat with that for a moment, the weight of a child's trust offered quietly, without drama, and then she opened the ledger again. What? The rain barrels were Caleb's project, though he hadn't been asked to make them one. She'd mentioned the idea to Silas and then spent 2 days figuring out the rigging herself. How many barrels they had, where the roof lines would channel the most runoff, what kind of diverters she could put together from the scrap lumber in the barn. She was working on the back corner of the house with a length of pipe and a lot of improvised thinking when Caleb appeared beside her and looked at what she was doing. "That angle's wrong," he said. She looked at the pipe. "You think so?" "Water'll sheet off instead of running into it. You want more of a..." He made a gesture with his hands, adjusting the imaginary angle. "More like that." She straightened up and looked at where he was pointing. He was right. She'd been calculating for rain coming straight down and not accounting for the angle of this particular roof line. "Show me," she said. He didn't look pleased about being asked. He also didn't walk away. He took the pipe from her and adjusted it, and she held it in place while he secured the bracket, and they worked for 2 hours in the cold without talking much except about the immediate problem of where water went and how to make it go somewhere useful. By the end of it, there were 4 barrels rigged along the back roofline that would actually work. "You're good at this kind of thing," she said. He shrugged. "Pa taught me." "He taught you well." Caleb picked up the leftover bracket and turned it in his hands. "My mother used to say Pa could build anything, but he couldn't figure out where to put it. He said it the way people say things they haven't meant to say, that come out on their own from somewhere they weren't guarding. Evelyn didn't make a big moment of it. Sounds about right," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it this time, closer than the first one, less quickly sealed. It was at the end of that same week that Gideon Ashcroft came to the ranch. She hadn't been expecting him. Nobody had told her much about what he looked like. So when the rider came through the gate in the late afternoon on a big gray horse with 2 other men behind him, she didn't know who it was until she saw Silas come out of the barn with his jaw set in a way she'd never seen before. Locked, rigid, the face of a man controlling something powerful with concentrated effort. She came out onto the porch. Gideon Ashcroft was perhaps 55, perhaps older. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 30 and had cured into something harder and more permanent. A tanned, weathered face with pale gray eyes that moved over the property with the comfortable possessiveness of a man counting something he already thinks of as his. He was well dressed for the frontier, not ostentatiously, just expensively, the kind of money that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. He looked at Silas with what appeared to be warmth and was actually closer to the performance of warmth. "Silas," he said, "I heard you took a wife. Thought I'd come welcome her to the valley." "Ashcroft," Silas said. His voice was even. She could hear what it was costing him. "This is Evelyn." Ashcroft turned to her. The gray eyes moved over her once. The same assessing look she'd gotten from half the men in Blackstone Ridge, but with something underneath it that was different. Something that was measuring not her usefulness, but her potential inconvenience. "Ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat. "You've taken on quite a project here." His eyes moved to the rain barrels along the roof line, then back to her. "Industrious." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "I've been meaning to speak to Silas about his water situation," Ashcroft said, still looking at her. "The creek's been unreliable this season. I have a water source on the northeast corner of my property that he's welcome to use pending a small arrangement." Silas said nothing. Evelyn said, "That's very generous. What kind of arrangement?" Ashcroft smiled. It was a good smile. It had been practiced. "Nothing complicated, a shared use agreement, some grazing rights on the south parcel in exchange for reliable water access, just neighborly cooperation." She looked at him. She thought about Clara's journal. The Halverson boys found a dead section of their north fence, wire cut, cattle branded A inside a circle going through, and she smiled back with exactly as much warmth as he'd given her, which was to say none of the real kind. "We'll think on it," she said. "It's kind of you to come all this way." Ashcroft held her gaze for a beat too long. "Of course." He looked at Silas. "You've got good land here, Silas. Shame to see it struggling. The offer stands." He turned his horse and rode back through the gate with his 2 men behind him. Silas didn't move until the horses were out of sight. Then his shoulders dropped about an inch, and he said, very quietly, a word she wasn't going to repeat. "He knows," Evelyn said. "He suspects." Silas turned to look at her. "Or he came to look us over. Either way. Either way, we need to move faster." She was already thinking. "How long until the marshal is in Millhaven? 10 days? Maybe 11? We have 10 days. She said it simply, without drama, and went back inside to start supper, because the children were going to be hungry, and the world did not stop requiring food just because a dangerous man had ridden through your gate and smiled at you. The nights were the hardest part. In the daytime, there was always something to do, always the next thing requiring her hands or her mind, or both, and she could keep the fear in her peripheral vision where it belonged. At night it came and sat directly in front of her, and she had to look at it. She lay in her room, the small room off the kitchen that had been a storage space before she arrived and still smelled faintly of dried herbs and dust, and she went through it. What they had, 7 journals with dated entries, names, locations, descriptions of brand markings and property lines and water samples collected in jars that Clara had labeled and stored. Evelyn had found those too, a row of small, sealed jars on the upper shelf of the bedroom, each one with a date and location written on a strip of paper tied around the neck. What a woman who had known someone was going to try to discredit her had done. She'd made it as hard as possible to dismiss what they were up against. A man with money and influence and a county sheriff who looked the other way, against a widowed rancher with a failing operation and a new wife who'd been traded for cattle and whose father would not be making any appearances on her behalf. She lay in the dark and did the accounting, and it was not encouraging. Then she thought about what Clara had done with the same accounting and kept going anyway, and she turned over and went to sleep. 8 days before the marshal was due in Millhaven, the twins found the water jars. Evelyn had moved them from the bedroom to the kitchen shelf. She wanted to look at them while she thought, and the bedroom felt wrong, too sealed. And Ida had come in quietly while she was outside and found them and told May. And when Evelyn came back inside, they were both standing at the counter examining the jars with serious, careful expressions. She almost told them to put them down. She stopped herself. "Those belong to your mother," she said instead. Ida looked up. Of the twins, Ida was the one who held things tighter, who had taken Evelyn's sewing kit, who rarely spoke but watched everything. Her face now was doing something complicated. "What are they?" May asked. "Water samples. From the creek and the well and some spots upstream. Your mother collected them because she thought something was wrong with the water." "She was right," Ida said. "The North Creek's been bad for over a year. The cattle won't drink from it if they can find anything else." Evelyn looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I watch things." Ida set the jar down carefully. "Pa doesn't know I go up to the north pasture, but I do. I've seen it. There's a place upstream where the bank looks wrong, like something was buried or poured and the ground didn't settle right after." Evelyn went still. "Can you show me?" she said. Ida glanced at May. May gave the smallest nod. "Not today," Ida said. "Tomorrow morning. Early." They went before sunrise, just the two of them, while the rest of the house slept. Ida moved through the dark land with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years, which she had, and Evelyn followed her north along the creek bed with her boots getting wet at the edges and the cold air biting at the back of her neck. It took 40 minutes to reach the place Ida meant. It was not dramatic to look at. That was the thing that struck her first. It was just a section of creek bank that looked slightly off. The soil a different color in a broad patch, maybe 10 feet wide. The vegetation around it thinner and yellowed where everything else was at least surviving the drought with brown dignity. There was a faint smell that she couldn't quite identify. Not strong. Almost nothing. The kind of smell that registers in the back of your nose and then your brain spends 30 seconds deciding if it's real. She crouched down and looked at the soil. She didn't touch it. "How far upstream is this from where we pull our well water?" she said. "Maybe 1.5 miles, Ida said. "Maybe 2. 2 miles was close enough. More than close enough." She looked at the creek bank for a long time. She thought about what Clara had written. The sediment is wrong. Not natural wrong, changed wrong. Somebody is doing something to that water upstream. She thought about what you would need to do to a water supply to gradually, deniably, over the course of months, make a ranch uninhabitable without anyone being able to definitively prove cause. You wouldn't do it dramatically. You'd do it just like this, a little, consistently, in a place most people didn't walk to, upstream of where the damage showed up. Patient, methodical. The work of someone who understood that slow damage was easier to deny than fast damage. She stood up. "Ida." "Yeah." "Don't come back here alone anymore." Ida looked at her sharply. "I've been coming here for—" "I know, and I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you." She looked at the girl. 10 years old, serious-faced, keeping her own counsel, Claire's daughter through and through. "Just not alone, okay?" A pause. "Okay," Ida said, "but you have to tell me what you and Pa are doing." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "We're going to make sure what your mother found doesn't get buried with her." Ida absorbed this. Her jaw tightened, a gesture identical to her father's. And she nodded and turned and started walking back toward the ranch, and Evelyn followed her through the gray pre-dawn light and thought about how this 10-year-old girl had just handed her the most important piece of physical evidence they had. She told Silas that evening. He went quiet in the way he went quiet when something hit him hard. Not withdrawal, but compression, like a man pushing down on something to keep it contained. "Someone's been depositing something upstream," she said. "I don't know what, but Ida's been watching that creek for a year, and she says the bank's been wrong since before Clara died." Silas's hands were flat on the table. "That means it's been going on for at least—" He stopped. "At least 18 months, probably longer." She paused. "It also means it wasn't natural. Drought doesn't leave a patch. Drought is everywhere. Can we prove it? Clara's water jars are dated and labeled. If we can get them to someone who knows what to look for, and if what they find matches what Clara described. The marshal isn't a scientist. No. But a federal marshal with dated evidence, witness testimony from multiple families, documented land purchases at below market value, and a written record from a woman who was specifically threatened for her investigation. That's a case." She looked at him. "It's not a perfect case, but it's a real one." He sat back. He ran a hand over his face. The lamplight made him look older than he was, or maybe he just was that old, older than 37 in the ways that mattered. "If we're wrong about any of it," he started. "We're not wrong about any of it," she said. "You know that." He looked at her across the table. "Yeah," he said. "I know that." Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving against the house, testing the boards the way it did when the weather was thinking about changing. She'd been meaning to check the window casings in the upstairs rooms. There were drafts coming through the south-facing ones that would be a real problem in hard winter. She made a mental note and filed it beside everything else. 6 days before the marshal arrived in Millhaven, the trouble came in a form she hadn't expected. She'd ridden into Blackstone Ridge to sell 3 dozen eggs and pick up medicine for Teddy, who developed a cough that wasn't alarming yet but deserved attention. She did this quickly and without engaging anyone beyond the minimum required by commerce, and she was tying her purchases to the saddle outside the general store when a woman stepped up beside her. The woman was perhaps 60, with a face that had made up its mind about the world and stuck to that decision. She wore good clothes, not wealthy but careful. She stopped beside Evelyn and looked at the street in front of her rather than at Evelyn directly. "You're the Boone woman," she said. "I am. My name is Ruth Halverson." A beat. "My sons had the ranch east of here before." Evelyn turned to look at her. Ruth Halverson was still looking at the street, but her hands on her bag were tight. "Clara Boone came to see me," Ruth said, "before she passed. She showed me what she'd been writing down. I told her it was too dangerous. I told her to let it go." Her jaw moved. "I've thought about that conversation every day since she died." "Mrs. Halverson, I'm not going to testify in front of anyone. I can't. I have grandchildren, and I'm not a brave woman. I know that about myself." She finally looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were steady and deeply unhappy. "But I can tell you where one of Ashcroft's men buried a pallet of steel drums on the upstream fork 3 years ago. I can tell you the exact location. My son watched them do it and drew a map because he was afraid, and then he sold and left and gave me the map because he didn't know what else to do with it." Evelyn didn't speak. Ruth opened her bag and took out a folded paper and pressed it into Evelyn's hand and closed her fingers around it. "Clara was right about all of it," she said. "Don't let them say she wasn't." She walked away down the boardwalk without looking back. Evelyn stood with the paper in her closed fist and breathed the cold air of Blackstone Ridge's main street and thought about courage and the different forms it came in. The loud form and the quiet form and the form that showed up years too late but still showed up. She put the paper in her coat pocket next to the medicine for Teddy and untied her horse and rode home. 5 days before the marshal, it snowed. Not heavily, not enough to block roads or change plans, but enough to make the world look different in the mornings. That particular quiet that falls with the first snow, where everything sounds farther away than it is. Rosie decided snow was a personal gift and spent an entire morning standing on the porch, holding her hands out to catch flakes, reporting their arrival to anyone who would listen. Teddy came outside long enough to help her build something that was intended to be a snowman, and was more accurately a lopsided column of snow with 2 sticks for arms, and he stood beside it with his hands in his pockets, looking at it with the deep critical concentration of someone evaluating structural engineering. "It's leaning," he said. "It's leaning on purpose," Rosie told him with great authority. "It's waving." Teddy considered this. "Oh," he said. "Okay." Evelyn watched them from the kitchen window and felt something in her chest that she didn't quite have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something more structural than that. Something that had to do with the way a house feels different when it's full of people who are not quite a family yet, but no longer quite strangers either. That afternoon, she and Silas sat at the kitchen table with everything laid out. Clara's 7 journals, the dated water jars, the notes Evelyn had been keeping, and Ruth Halverson's folded map. Silas read the map slowly, his index finger tracing the creek line to the upstream fork. "I know this spot," he said. "I've ridden past it. I thought the ground looked wrong, but I was thinking about the drought, and He stopped. "I didn't think hard enough about it." "You were grieving," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No, but it's a reason." She paused. "The question now is how we carry this into Millhaven without Ashcroft knowing before we get there." "We go at night," Silas said. "Leave before dawn, separate from the children." "The children can't be left alone." "Caleb's 14. She thought about Caleb, the boy who'd eaten the beans out of anger, who'd helped her angle the rain barrels, who was currently somewhere in the barn doing something that involved a lot of focused hammering. "Caleb's capable," she said, "but 5 days is a long time to ask him to hold together." "Not 5 days. One morning. We leave before sunrise, we're in Millhaven by midday, we're back by nightfall." Silas looked at her. "Unless you think we need more time with the marshal." "I think we need to be very organized when we walk in," she said. "We get one conversation. It needs to count." They spent the next 3 evenings organizing. She wrote out a summary, clear, sequential, dated, of everything Claire had documented, everything Evelyn had observed, what Ruth Halverson had said and given them. She was a good writer, which surprised Silas, or maybe it didn't surprise him as much as it confirmed something he'd been noticing. She wrote the way Clara had kept journals, without decoration, without gaps, in a way designed to be read by someone who didn't already believe it and needed to. Caleb found her at this one night, sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, writing by lamplight. He stood in the doorway in his socks and his nightshirt and looked at the pages spread across the table and said, "What are you writing?" "A letter to a federal marshal," she said. "Go to bed." He didn't go to bed. He came and stood beside her and looked at the pages. He read fast, tracking down the lines, and she let him because she was too tired to argue, and because, honestly, because he deserved to know. When he finished reading, he straightened up and stood there for a moment. "This is about Ashcroft," he said. "Yes. And about what might have happened to my mother." She looked at him directly. "Yes." Caleb's face went through several things very fast. She watched him push them down one by one, the way his father did, until what was left was just the jaw. Set hard, controlled. "Are you and Pa going to be safe?" he said. "We're going to be careful," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't." He stood there another moment. "I'll watch the kids," he said. "When you go. I'll keep them inside and I won't let them. I'll handle it." "I know you will," she said. He went back upstairs. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs and the quiet close of his door, and then she turned back to the pages and kept writing. So, 2 days before they planned to ride for Millhaven, Evelyn woke at 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Not the ordinary smell of a banked fire going cold or the kitchen stove breathing wrong. The smell of something outside burning, sharp and moving, the kind of smell that comes through walls. She was out of her bed before she was fully awake, and she was fully awake by the time she reached the kitchen door and threw it open and saw the orange light against the black sky coming from the direction of the barn. It wasn't the barn. Not yet. It was the hay shed, the smaller structure to the left of the barn, filled with the winter stores, filling the night with a fast-rolling flame that was already taller than the shed's roof peak. And there were horses coming through the front gate. Not one horse, not a neighbor. Riders. She counted 4, 5, coming through the gate at a canter with the firelight catching them in pieces. And she recognized the shape of organization in the way they split. 2 going left, 2 going right, 1 staying at the gate. The shape of people who had done this before and knew what they were doing. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the house. She turned and ran upstairs. She hit Silas's door with her fist. "Riders, 5 of them. Hay sheds burning. Get your rifle." She didn't wait to hear his response. She was already moving to the children's rooms. Evelyn hit Caleb's door first because he was the oldest and she needed him thinking before she needed the others moving. "Caleb, up. Now. Riders in the yard. Fire at the hay shed. Get your sisters and Teddy into the back bedroom and stay there." She heard him land on the floor before she'd finished the sentence. Good. She went to the twins' room, pushed the door open. They were already sitting up, May blinking, Ida already swinging her legs over the side of the bed with her jaw set in a way that reminded Evelyn so sharply of Silas it almost stopped her breath. "Fire outside," Evelyn said. "Go with Caleb. Back bedroom. Door locked. You don't open it for anyone except me or your father. Understand?" "What about—" May started. "Now," Evelyn said. She was already moving to Teddy's room. He was harder to wake. He came up slowly from sleep like someone surfacing from deep water. And she had to put her hands on his shoulders and say his name twice before his eyes focused. "I need you to be brave right now," she said. "Can you do that?" He nodded, still half asleep. Trusting her in that way, small children trust the adults who have been consistent with them. It cost her something to see it. "Go with Caleb. Back bedroom." She found Rosie last. The little girl was standing in the center of her room in her nightgown, wide awake, because the smell of smoke had reached her and she was 4 years old and knew what it meant. She didn't cry. She held her arms up. Evelyn picked her up, the solid, warm weight of her, and carried her to the hallway where Caleb was already gathering the twins. "Take her," Evelyn said. Caleb took Rosie without comment. Rosie went with him without protest, which was its own small testimony to how much had changed in 3 weeks. "Evelyn," Caleb said. She was already heading for the stairs. "Evelyn," his voice was tighter now. "Be careful." She didn't stop. She said, "Back bedroom," and went downstairs. The front door was still closed when she got to the ground floor. She could hear Silas at the upper window, the crack of his rifle, the reload, the crack again, measured and deliberate. He was a good shot. She'd seen him take a running coyote at distance the week before without appearing to particularly try. She trusted him to hold the front. The back of the house was her problem. She went to the kitchen, and in the low orange light coming through the window, she grabbed the cast iron skillet from the hook because it was the heaviest object within reach, and she could swing it, and she could throw it, and she had once, at age 14, used one to stop a dog that was going for her brother's throat, so she knew exactly what it felt like to commit to the swing. She flattened herself against the wall beside the back door and listened. Footsteps on the porch, not trying to be quiet. A man who is not trying to be quiet is either confident or stupid, and the riders who had organized themselves so cleanly coming through the gate were not stupid. The door handle turned. She'd locked it. The bolt was thrown. But the wood of the door frame was old, and the man on the other side of it hit it with his shoulder once, and she felt the frame shift, and on the second hit, it gave. He came through fast, the way men come through doors they've broken down, momentum carrying him forward and slightly low, and Evelyn swung. The skillet caught him across the side of the head, and the sound it made was not like anything she wanted to think about afterward. He went down. Not gracefully. The way a tree goes down, sudden, total, no negotiation. He hit the kitchen floor and did not get up. She stood over him, breathing hard. He was one of Ashcroft's men. She recognized him, not by name, but by the silver concho on his hatband that had caught the firelight when they'd ridden through the gate. She looked at him for 2 seconds, confirmed he was breathing, and stepped over him. The hay shed was beyond saving. She'd understood that the moment she'd seen the height of the flames. But the barn was not yet burning, and the barn was where the horses were. And without horses, they had nothing. No way to reach Millhaven. No way to get out if they needed to. No way forward at all. She crossed the yard at a dead run, with the skillet still in her hand and the smoke thick in the cold air and the fire hot on the left side of her face. There was a man between her and the barn door, not a rider. He dismounted and he was on foot and he was carrying something. A lamp, she realized, a lit lamp. The clear intention being to do to the barn what had already been done to the hay shed. He hadn't seen her yet. He was focused on the barn door, on the lamp in his hand, on the task in front of him with the concentration of a man who had been given a job. She hit him from behind and slightly to the side, not with the skillet this time. She didn't want to kill him. She needed him conscious, shoulder into his back, her full weight behind it, which was not a small amount of weight. And he went forward into the barn door with a crash that startled the horses inside into a brief screaming panic. The lamp left his hand. She saw it leave his hand and she saw where it was going to land, and she moved. 3 steps, fast, dropped to one knee, and she caught it. The hot glass burned her palm. She set it down on the dirt in the most controlled way she could manage, and then she put her boot on it and ground it out and stood up. The man was on the ground, winded, not hurt badly, trying to get his bearings. She pulled the barn door open and took him by the collar and dragged him inside and threw the latch behind her. "Don't," she said, because he was reaching for something at his belt. "I already took down one of your friends tonight. I am not having a good evening, and I am not feeling patient." He looked up at her. He was maybe 40, with the face of a man who had made a long series of practical decisions and ended up here. And what she saw in his eyes was not bravado, but a fairly clear calculation. "Smart," she said. "Put it on the floor." He set the knife on the ground. She kicked it to the far side of the barn. Outside, Silas's rifle was still working. She could hear 2 or 3 shots at intervals. Not panicked, not rapid, controlled. She could also hear horses moving, and then shouting, and then one of the riders came around the side of the barn on horseback, and she could see through the gap in the barn, sighting the shape of him against the fire. He pulled up short when he didn't see his partner. "Mitch," he called. His voice was uncertain. She pressed against the wall and said nothing. The man on the ground had sense enough to stay quiet, or maybe he was still too winded to call out. The rider waited. Then the rifle cracked again from the direction of the house, and the rider made a fast decision and turned his horse and went back around the front. She heard hoofbeats, receding, not advancing, and she thought, "They're pulling back." She heard one more shot, then silence. The kind of silence that follows the end of something violent is different from ordinary silence. She'd never been in a gunfight before, and she didn't know that exactly, but she felt it, the texture of it, the stunned quality, the way even the horses knew something had just shifted. She waited 60 seconds. She was counting. Then she heard Silas's voice from the direction of the house, calling her name. Not panicked, just calling, looking for her. "Barn!" she shouted back. His footsteps crossed the yard. The barn door rattled. "Latch is thrown!" she called. She opened it from inside. He stood in the doorway with his rifle in his hand and his face lit orange from the still-burning hay shed behind him. He was breathing hard. There was a cut above his right eye that was bleeding in the unhurried way of shallow cuts, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder, but he was standing. He looked at her. He looked at the man on the floor of the barn. He looked back at her. "The one in the kitchen is yours too?" he said. "He broke the door frame," she said. I was irritated. Silas stared at her for another moment. Then something crossed his face that she didn't know how to categorize. It wasn't humor, not exactly, but it was related to it, the way a man looks when something lands that he wasn't expecting. "Are you hurt?" he said. She looked at her palm. The burn from the lamp glass was going to blister. "My hand a little, it'll keep." She looked at the man on the ground. "What do we do with them?" "Tie them to the porch post and send for the sheriff in the morning," Silas said. "Even if the sheriff does nothing, there'll be a record." She thought about that. The county sheriff who looked the other way. A record that Ashcroft's money could make disappear. She thought about the marshal in Millhaven and the fact that they now had 2 days less than they'd thought. "How many rode off?" she asked. 3, I think. Maybe 4? His voice was careful. "Evelyn, they're going to go back and report. Ashcroft's going to know it didn't work. I know. Which means, I know. She picked up the skillet from where she'd set it. We can't wait 2 more days. He looked at her. The children. We take them with us. She said it before she'd finished thinking it through, and then she thought it through in the following 3 seconds, and it still held. We can't leave them here. Not now. Not with 3 or 4 of his men loose, and him knowing we have the journals. Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hay shed was settling into itself. The fire going lower now, but still hot, the smell of it everywhere. We leave at 4 in the morning, he said. We leave at 3, she said. It's already past 2. Well, getting 5 children dressed, provisioned, and onto horses or into the wagon bed in less than an hour in the dark, after they have just heard and smelled a fire and felt their house shake with a broken door. This was not, as it turned out, as hard as it should have been, because Caleb had already done half of it. When she got upstairs, he had Teddy in his coat, Rosie wrapped in her blanket, and the twins in their boots. And he had also, she noticed, packed a bag. A practical bag, not with toys or unnecessary things, but with what a 14-year-old who had been paying attention understood you needed when you left in a hurry. He'd put Clara's journals in it, all 7 of them. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. I could hear what was happening, he said. I figured we weren't staying. She didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about the boy who had eaten the beans to make a point, and she thought about this boy standing in the upstairs hallway with 5 children's worth of survival packed and ready, and she understood they were the same boy, but that something had moved in him. Good thinking on the journals, she said. He gave her the smallest nod. What about the water jars? I have them in my room, already wrapped. She had wrapped them 2 days ago. She'd known, in the way you know things you don't want to know, that the timetable was going to accelerate. Get the little ones downstairs, quietly. May was watching her from the doorway of the twins' room. Are we going to be okay? She asked. May was the one who asked questions directly. Ida was the one who already knew the answers and was deciding what to do with them. Yes, Evelyn said. She said it without hesitation because the children needed to hear it without hesitation. Whether it was true was a different matter, and she would think about that on horseback. They loaded the wagon in the dark with the hay shed still smoldering behind them. Silas had tied both of Ashcroft's men to the porch post. The one from the kitchen had a head that was going to hurt for a week, but was conscious enough to be cooperative about the tying. Silas left a note on the front door, addressed to the county sheriff, documenting what had occurred and naming the 2 men who could be found at the post. It was probably useless. He wrote it anyway. Evelyn put Rosie in the wagon bed first, buried in blankets between 2 rolled quilts so she was wedged and wouldn't roll. Rosie had asked no questions. She was holding her rag doll with the particular grip of a child who has decided that as long as she holds the important thing, it will all be okay, and Evelyn did not disabuse her of this theory. Teddy climbed in beside Rosie without being asked and put his back against the wagon side in a way that said clearly he was going to be her barrier for the duration. He was 7 years old, and he had made this decision entirely on his own, and Evelyn filed it away. The twins rode. Ida took to her horse immediately, no adjustment, sitting the saddle like she'd been born in it, which possibly she had. May was slightly less certain, but her chin was up in a way that suggested she would rather fall off than ask for help. Caleb rode beside the wagon. He hadn't asked where he was riding. He just positioned himself there. Silas drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench. They were moving before 3. 11 miles to Millhaven. The road was nothing to compliment in daylight and worse in the dark, but the horses knew the general direction and Silas knew every rut personally, and they made time. No one spoke much. The cold was the kind that gets into your neck and the backs of your hands, and Rosie fell asleep within the first mile in the way small children can fall asleep in moving vehicles, regardless of all prior drama, which was a mercy. About 3 miles out, Silas said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the children, "You could have been hurt tonight." "So could you," she said. "I'm used to things like that." She looked at him in the dark. "What makes you think I'm not?" He thought about that. "Fair point," he said after a moment. They rode another half mile. The sky ahead was still black, but the black was thinning at the edges. Not yet dawn, but leaning toward the idea of it. "Why didn't you run?" he said. "The back of the house was clear. You could have gotten out." She hadn't thought about it that way. She genuinely hadn't. She tried to reconstruct the 3 a.m. kitchen, the broken door, the man coming through, and she could not locate in her memory any moment where running had presented itself as an option. "The barn would have gone," she said. "We needed the horses." "Evelyn." "What?" He didn't say anything for a moment. The horses moved. The wagon creaked. Off to the east, something, an owl maybe, made a sound and stopped. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She looked at the road ahead. "We're not finished yet," she said. The marshal's name was Roland Creed, and he was a smaller man than she'd expected, compact and gray-haired, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that appeared to be cataloging everything they landed on, regardless of what his expression was doing. He was eating breakfast in the Millhaven Hotel dining room when they came in just after 8 a.m, 5 children in various states of road travel dishevelment, 2 adults who had not slept, and a canvas bag containing 7 journals and a wrapped set of water sample jars. He looked at them all, did a count, and said, "I take it this isn't a social call." "Marshal Creed," Silas said. "My name is Silas Boone. My ranch is 11 miles east of here. Last night, 4 or 5 men employed by Gideon Ashcroft burned my hay shed, attacked my wife and myself, and attempted to burn the barn. We have 2 of them tied to my porch post." He set the canvas bag on the table beside Creed's coffee. "We also have evidence of a years-long operation to poison water supplies across the valley in order to force ranchers off their land for below-market acquisition." Creed looked at the bag. He looked at Silas. His eyes moved to Evelyn. "And you are?" "Evelyn Boone." She sat down across from him without being invited, because they had ridden 11 miles in the dark and she was not standing for this conversation. "My husband's late wife documented the operation beginning approximately 2 years before her death. I'd like you to read what she wrote." Creedy looked at her for a measured moment. Then he pushed his breakfast plate to the side and said, "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." She started from the beginning. She didn't leave anything out. An hour and 40 minutes. That was how long it took. She talked, Silas added. She laid the journals out in order and pointed to the relevant entries. She showed him Ruth Halverson's map. She unwrapped the water jars one by one and read Clara's labeling aloud. Location, date, description of color, and smell. And she laid out the timeline. Which ranches had reported water problems, which had sold, what Ashcroft had paid, what the land was worth. She had it all organized in her head. She had organized it there over 3 weeks of kitchen table nights when everyone was asleep, running through it the way you run through something you need to know without flaw because there might not be a second chance to say it. Creed listened. He asked questions. They were good questions, precise, specific. The questions of a man who understood land law and evidence and the difference between accusation and proof. Some of her answers were strong, some had gaps. She told him where the gaps were, rather than trying to fill them with speculation, because she understood that a federal marshal would find the gaps on his own, and she would rather he found them because she'd named them than because she'd tried to hide them. When she finished, Creed sat for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup. "The 2 men on your porch post," he said. "You can identify them as being among the riders?" "I can identify one by the silver concho on his hat band," she said. "Silas can speak to the others." "The water jars." He looked at the row of them. "These have been in storage for over a year. Chain of custody is going to be a question." Clara Boone sealed them herself and labeled them in her own handwriting, which matches the journals. The journals include an entry describing her collection method and her reasons for it. Evelyn paused. She was a careful woman. She knew someone might try to say she was wrong, and she made it as hard as possible for them. Creed looked at her for a moment. You didn't know her? No. But you know what she did. I read everything she wrote, Evelyn said. 3 times. Something moved in Creed's face. Not sentimentality. Something more professional than that. A kind of recognition. I'm going to need to ride out to your ranch and examine the scene, he said. I'm also going to want to take those jars to a man in Mill Haven who can tell me if there's anything in them that shouldn't be there. He stood up. And I'm going to need you both to make formal statements before I can touch Ashcroft. We'll stay in Mill Haven for that, Silas said. Creed nodded. He picked up one of the journals and turned it in his hands, not opening it, just holding it. Gideon Ashcroft, he said, has been on my list for approximately 8 months. Nobody's been willing to bring me anything I could use. He set the journal down. Until today. He said it flat, without emphasis, and it landed anyway. They filed statements that afternoon in the Mill Haven courthouse. A small, cold room with a clerk who wrote everything down in a hand much slower than the pace at which they spoke. The children waited in the hotel lobby. Caleb had taken charge of this without being asked, sitting in the largest chair with Rosie on his knee and the twins on either side, and Teddy at his feet drawing something in the dust on the floorboards with a stick. When Evelyn came out after 2 hours, she stood in the doorway and watched this arrangement for a moment before any of them saw her. May looked up first. Are we done? The marshal is. We still need to wait. Ida said, What are we waiting for? Ashcroft, Evelyn said. Creed is bringing him in for questioning. This was technically true. What she didn't say was that bringing Gideon Ashcroft in for questioning was not a simple operation and would require Creed to ride back to Blackstone Ridge with his deputy, and that there was every chance Ashcroft had been warned. He had informants everywhere, which was the point of a man like Ashcroft. He built his network precisely for moments like this, and that none of what happened next was certain. She sat down in the lobby, and Rosie climbed off Caleb's knee and onto hers without ceremony, and she held the little girl and looked at the wall and thought about all the variables she could not control. Silas came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and she let it be there because she was very tired, and it helped. Creed rode back in the late afternoon of the following day, and he was not alone. He had his deputy and 2 additional federal men she hadn't seen before, and he had Gideon Ashcroft. Ashcroft was not in restraints. He rode in the middle of the group on his gray horse with his back straight, and his expression carrying the studied calm of a man who has survived difficult situations before by never appearing to acknowledge they were difficult. He was talking to Creed as they rode in. She could see it from the hotel window, the practiced body language of a man making his case in the most comfortable possible register. She watched him, and she felt something cold and clear move through her. He was going to try to kill this in conversation before it reached any kind of formal proceeding. He had the manner for it, the money for it, the experience for it. He had probably already identified every weak point in their case and was constructing his counter-narrative on horseback. What he did not know about yet, or might not, was Ruth Halverson's map. The physical location of the drums, the upstream fork where the ground had been disturbed and where Ida had watched and where Clara had taken her water samples. Because that, if Creed's Mill Haven contact had found what she believed was in the jars, was the thing you could not argue away with manner and money. That was physical. That was there in the ground, still there, real in a way that testimony could be challenged and documents could be questioned, but a buried pallet of corroding steel drums could not. Creed had sent 2 men to the location the previous evening with Ruth Halverson's map. She was waiting to hear what they'd found. She heard it in the next 20 minutes when Creed came to the hotel without Ashcroft and sat down across from her and Silas and said, "They found the drums." The room was very quiet. 4 of them, he said. Steel, heavily corroded, contents consistent with an industrial compound you'd use on a large scale if you wanted to degrade a water source gradually and deniably over a period of years. 2 had partially collapsed into the creek bed. He looked at them steadily. The contents in the water jars match. Silas had gone very still. Evelyn put her hand flat on the table. "That's what killed Clara," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Creed's face did something careful. I can't make that determination. It would require a medical examination of a case that's over a year old, and the body is... He stopped. What I can tell you is that prolonged exposure to the compound found in those drums, through drinking water, would cause symptoms consistent with what was described in her medical record. Silas nodded. His hands were under the table. She couldn't see them. She said, "What happens now?" "I formally charge Ashcroft. I hold him here pending transfer to federal jurisdiction." Creed paused. "He's downstairs. He knows about the drums. He's been told." He looked at Evelyn specifically. He asked who built the case. She met his gaze. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the evidence built the case, which is true." A beat. "But he's not a stupid man, and he's seen you twice now, and he's going to draw his own conclusion." She understood what he was telling her. She nodded. What she didn't expect was that Ashcroft would not wait to draw his conclusion. Yeah. She was crossing the hotel lobby an hour later, going to get Rosie, who had fallen asleep upstairs and needed to eat, when she saw him. He was in the lobby. Creed's deputy was supposed to be with him and was not. She found out later the deputy had stepped outside for 2 minutes, the precise 2 minutes that a man like Ashcroft had been waiting for. He was standing near the door with his hat in his hands and his coat on, and when she came down the stairs and he saw her, something shifted in his face. The studied calm was still there, but underneath it was something else. The face of a man who has built something over years, who has controlled and managed and acquired and grown, who is watching all of it come apart, and who has decided in 2 minutes of unsupervised time that there is one action left available to him. She saw his hand move toward his coat. She had no weapon. She had never been a woman who carried weapons, which at this precise moment she was going to rethink. What she had was 11 years of being underestimated, and she was at the bottom of the stairs, which put her 6 feet away and at a height advantage, and she had been lifting, hauling, kneading and carrying and working since she was 8 years old, and Gideon Ashcroft was 55 and had not done physical labor in 2 decades. She moved, not toward him, at him. The difference mattered. Toward was slow, hesitant, giving him time. At was committed, was total, was her full weight in motion before he'd cleared the pistol from his coat. She hit him at the chest with her shoulder, and they went back together into the wall beside the door, and the pistol in his hand discharged into the ceiling. A crack so loud in the enclosed space, it felt like the air broke. And she had his wrist, both hands, driving it down and back until he made a sound, and the gun fell to the floor. The lobby erupted. The deputy came through the front door. Creed was on the stairs in 4 seconds. 2 of the hotel staff appeared from somewhere. Ashcroft was on the floor with Evelyn's knee on his arm, not because she'd planned it that way, but because that was where they'd ended up, and she was breathing so hard she could feel it in her ears. Creed came and took Ashcroft by the collar and pulled him upright, and the deputy put the restraints on. Real ones this time. Ashcroft stood between them and looked at Evelyn with the gray eyes that had assessed and cataloged and dismissed her the first time they'd met. And what she saw in them now was something she didn't take satisfaction in. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was the look of a man who had recalculated something and found the answer was not what he'd expected. She stood up. Her knees were unsteady, a little, which she thought was probably reasonable given that a gun had just gone off approximately 18 inches from her face. She picked up the fallen pistol and handed it to Creed, grip first, without being asked. "Attempted assault on a witness," Creed said to nobody in particular. "In front of a federal marshal." He looked at Ashcroft with the expression of a very tired man. "That was stupid, Gideon." Ashcroft said nothing. Silas appeared at the top of the stairs. He'd heard the shot and come from the room where they'd been waiting, and he stood now looking down at the scene in the lobby. Ashcroft in restraints, Creed with the confiscated pistol, Evelyn standing in the center of it with her hair loose from where it had come down in the struggle, and her hands not quite steady, and the expression of a woman who has decided to stop being afraid now and take stock of that decision later. He came down the stairs. He stood beside her. She said quietly, just to him, "I'm fine." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the way she was holding her hands together to stop them shaking. He looked at the hole in the lobby ceiling. "Yeah," he said. I can see that. It took her a moment to realize he wasn't being sarcastic. He meant it the way she'd meant it the night she'd carried the journals to the barn, not as a performance of strength, but as a recognition of it. A real recognition, without qualifications. She exhaled. Caleb was at the top of the stairs with the younger children behind him. They'd all heard the shot, of course they had, and he was looking down at the lobby with his hand on the banister and his face doing the complicated rapid-fire processing that 14-year-olds do when something violent has just happened and they're trying to decide which emotion to lead with. He looked at Evelyn. "You tackled him," he said. "I had to be fast," she said. A pause. "That was—" He stopped. He looked at the ceiling where the shot had gone. He looked at Ashcroft being walked out the door by Creed and the deputy. He looked back at her. "Yeah," he said. She thought that might be the most genuine thing he'd ever said to her. The ride back to the Boone Ranch the next morning was nothing like the ride out. The ride out had been dark and cold and held together by necessity. Everyone keeping quiet because the situation required it, the children understanding without being told that this was not a moment for noise. The ride back was different in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. The sky was clear. Rosie sat up in the wagon bed instead of being buried in blankets and narrated everything she saw. A hawk, a brown dog near a fence post, a cloud that she said looked like a potato but that Teddy maintained looked like a boot. They argued about this for 2 miles with the mild intensity of people who have nothing more urgent to argue about, which was new. Caleb rode beside the wagon again, but this time he wasn't positioned there out of protective instinct. He was just riding, sitting the horse loosely, occasionally looking at the landscape with an expression that had released something, some held thing, some watching for danger thing that a 14-year-old boy should not have been carrying as long as he had. Silas drove. Evelyn sat beside him. Her hand, where the lamp glass had burned it 2 nights ago, was wrapped in cloth she'd gotten from the hotel. It hurt in the steady, factual way burns hurt. Not dramatically, just constantly. A reminder that certain things had been real. She'd stopped noticing it much. There were other things to pay attention to. Ashcroft's operation goes wider than the valley, Silas said, after they'd been riding a while. He'd been thinking. She could tell by the particular quality of his silence, the kind that wasn't empty but was working. Creed said as much, that there were cases in 2 other counties that might tie back. Which means this isn't over for him, she said. Just for us. Yeah. He looked at the road ahead. For us, it's over. She thought about what over looked like. The hay shed was gone. That was real. That was a winter's worth of stored feed, ash, and loss. And they were going to feel that in the months ahead. The barn was standing. The house was standing. 2 of Ashcroft's men had been taken in alongside their employer, which left the ones who'd ridden off, which left a period of uncertainty that wouldn't fully resolve until word spread through the county that Gideon Ashcroft was in federal custody, and the people who'd worked for him started making their own calculations about loyalty to a finished enterprise. None of this was clean. None of it resolved into a picture you could frame. But the drums were out of the ground. Creed had men pulling them the previous afternoon, documenting everything, sealing the site. The creek would take time. You couldn't just remove the source and watch a year of contamination vanish overnight, but it would recover. Clara's journals had said there'd been a time when the North Creek ran clean, which meant the clean was still there underneath, waiting. The Halverson boys might come back, she said, if they hear the land's safe again. Maybe. Silas's voice was careful, not committing to hope he hadn't earned yet. Ruth Halverson did right by us. She did right by Clara, Evelyn said. We just benefited from it. He was quiet for a moment. You do that a lot, he said. Do what? Give the credit somewhere else. She looked at the road. She didn't have a response to that wasn't either falsely modest or more honest than she felt like being at 7 in the morning on a wagon bench with burn-wrapped hands. The rain barrels are probably fine, she said instead. We'll know when we get there. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest neighbor to one. The ranch looked smaller when they returned to it. That was the only word she had for it. Not damaged, not ruined, just smaller, the way things look when you've been somewhere else and come back and have to readjust your eyes to the actual scale of your life. The hay shed was a black footprint on the ground to the left of the barn, still smelling of char. The barn itself was fine. The house was fine. 2 of the rain barrels had filled overnight from the weather they'd missed while they were in Mill Haven. Ashcroft's men were gone from the porch post. Creed's deputy had come through while they were filing statements and collected them, which was efficient and saved Silas from having to decide what to do with them himself. The note Silas had left on the front door was gone too, taken as evidence, presumably, and the door itself stood open an inch from where the frame had been broken. Evelyn looked at the frame. She thought about the man who'd come through it, and the skillet and the sound, and then she stopped thinking about it because some things you needed to file away in a specific drawer and close and not open frequently. "I can fix that today," Caleb said, coming up beside her and looking at the frame with the appraising eye he'd shown on the rain barrel project. "That would be useful," she said. He nodded and went to the barn for tools. She went inside to start a fire and make breakfast. The news reached Blackstone Ridge faster than she'd expected. By the following week, Creed had formally charged Gideon Ashcroft with criminal conspiracy, fraudulent land acquisition, contamination of a shared water source, assault on a federal witness, and the charge that hit hardest, that spread through the town like cold water, criminal negligence in connection with the death of Clara Marie Boone. That last charge was the one that changed the air in Blackstone Ridge, because Clara Boone had been from here. She'd been known here. She'd attended the church socials and bought fabric at the dry goods store, and her children had sat in the schoolhouse, and people had stood at her grave and said what a shame it was, a fever, such a young woman, and had gone home and not thought too hard about what they might have noticed if they'd wanted to. The reckoning with that was uncomfortable and unglamorous in public, and Evelyn was not going to pretend it was satisfying to watch. It was mostly just sad. People who had looked the other way, not out of malice, but out of the ordinary human preference for not being involved with dangerous things. People who had believed the county sheriff because it was easier than not believing him. The sheriff himself, quietly removed from his position pending investigation into what Creed described in careful federal language as inappropriate associations with the accused party, which everyone understood to mean he'd been paid. There was no dramatic moment in the town square. There was no gathering of all the people to witness Ashcroft's humiliation in front of the community he'd terrorized, though she understood the story was going to make it sound that way in the retelling. What actually happened was paperwork and depositions and a federal proceeding in a courthouse 40 miles away that Silas attended twice with the journals and the water jars and his own formal statement, and Evelyn attended once to give her testimony about what she'd seen in the hotel lobby. And both times they left the children with the Halverson woman who had started visiting with the tentative regularity of someone working out a debt she could never fully pay. Ruth Halverson turned out to be a practical woman who knew a great deal about canning and very little about ranching, and on her 3rd visit she stayed for supper and Rosie climbed into her lap without being invited and fell asleep there, which seemed to affect Ruth in ways she didn't have the vocabulary for. She sat very still with the little girl on her lap, and looked at the table with a complicated face and didn't say much for the rest of the evening. She came back the following week, and the week after. What happened to the valley happened slowly, the way most real recoveries happen, not with a single dramatic turn, but with an accumulation of small and often inconvenient improvements that you only recognized as improvement when you looked back at where you'd been. The drums came out of the upstream fork over the course of 4 days. Creed brought in men who knew what they were handling, which was good because what was in those drums was not something you wanted moved carelessly. The creek bank was treated and sealed. Creed's man, the one in Millhaven who'd analyzed the water jars, came out and took new samples at intervals downstream and said the contamination was clearing, that it would take months more, but the trajectory was right. The Halverson boys did come back. Not immediately. They had built something in the east and uprooting it was not simple, but the elder one, Ray, rode through in early spring and stood at the fence line of his old property and looked at the land for a long time. The land had been seized as part of Ashcroft's assets pending the federal case. There were proceedings about what happened to it. Silas told Evelyn about this one evening, and she said, "Someone should make sure Ray knows there's a process for recovering fraudulently acquired property. Silas looked at her and said, "You want to write that letter?" She said yes. She wrote it. Ray Halverson filed the appropriate claim 2 months later. She was not a lawyer. She had no legal training. The letter was imperfect and required correction by the federal clerk who received it, but it started something that needed starting, and that was what mattered. The thing about the children was that nothing happened in a moment. That was the thing she most wanted to be clear about in her own mind, because it would have been easy, looking back from the other side of it, to identify a turning point, to say, this was when Caleb came around. This was when Ida stopped watching her like a threat assessment. This was when Teddy started talking more. This was when May and she reached something that felt like affection. But it didn't work that way. It was never a single thing. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Caleb showed her something he'd built in the barn and stood sideways to her and watched for her reaction, and she gave him an honest one. It was Ida appearing in the doorway of Clara's room one afternoon while Evelyn was returning the journals to the desk. She'd kept them there since the federal proceedings, where they belonged, and not saying anything, just standing there, and Evelyn not making it strange by over-explaining. It was May asking, completely out of nowhere during a completely ordinary supper, "Did you always want to be a mother?" The table went quiet. Silas looked up from his plate. Evelyn thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I wanted to be useful. I wanted to do something that mattered. I didn't think much about mother, specifically." May considered this. "Do you think about it now?" Evelyn looked at the table, but Caleb at the far end, Ida and May side by side, Teddy eating with the methodical focus of someone who takes food seriously, Rosie with her spoon in her fist and beans on her chin. She looked at Silas, who was watching her with the expression he'd developed recently of a man who is paying close attention to something he values. "I think about whether you're all warm and fed and learning things," she said. "Whether that's mother or something else, I'm not sure it matters what we call it." May appeared to find this acceptable. She went back to her food. Rosie said, "I call it mama." She said it without drama, without preamble, in the same tone she used to report the arrival of snowflakes on her palms. Just a statement of her own taxonomy. The table was quiet. Evelyn looked at the 4-year-old with beans on her chin and felt something move through her chest that she was not going to be able to hold very successfully together. And rather than try, she just said, "Okay, Rosie," in as steady a voice as she could produce, and reached over and wiped the beans off the little girl's chin with her thumb. Later, much later, after the children were in bed, she sat in the kitchen in the dark the way she had in the early weeks, except that this time Silas came and sat with her. He'd started doing that. Not every night, but often enough that it had become a thing with a shape, a part of the day they both knew was there. He put a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table and didn't say anything for a while. "That was the first time she said that," he said. "I know. Clara would have—" He stopped. Started again. "Clara would have liked you." He said it carefully, meaning it precisely, not as a performance of generosity. "She would have trusted you. She didn't trust easily." Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cup. The burn on her palm had healed to a scar that she was going to have permanently, which she'd been told by the Millhaven doctor and had absorbed without much feeling, because she had never put much store in her appearance, and a scar on her palm was not going to change anything she was trying to do. "I trust her," she said. "What she wrote. How she thought." She paused. "I feel like I know her." Silas nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. "She was afraid at the end," he said. "I knew something was wrong, but she didn't tell me all of it. She was trying to protect us." "She was. I should have made her tell me." "You couldn't have made Clara Boone do anything she'd decided not to do. That's clear from every journal." He looked up, that almost laugh again. "No," he said. "That's true." They sat for a while in the kitchen that had been a cold and nearly empty room when she'd first stood in it. That was different now, not because she'd changed the room exactly, but because a room changes when people start using it for things that matter. "I'd like to put a marker on the upstream site," Silas said, "where the drums were, something with her name on it." She thought about that. "Not there," she said. "She wouldn't want to be marked at the place that killed her. Put it somewhere she liked, where the kids can go." He was quiet for a long moment. She liked the North Ridge. She used to take the children up there when the weather was good. There then. He nodded. They didn't say anything else about it that night. But the following week, on a Saturday that was cold but dry, Silas took all 5 children and Evelyn up to the North Ridge, and they placed a flat stone with Clara's name and her dates cut into it by Caleb, who had taught himself engraving from a book with the same focused stubbornness he applied to everything he decided to learn. The engraving was imperfect, the letters slightly uneven, the dates a little crowded at the end. Caleb looked at it with the dissatisfied expression of someone comparing what they'd made to what they'd intended. "It's good," Teddy said, standing beside him and looking at the stone with serious consideration. "The C is off," Caleb said. "Mama wouldn't care about the C," Ida said. She was standing slightly apart from the group, her arms crossed, her face doing the private processing thing it did when she was feeling something she hadn't decided how to manage yet. "How do you know?" Caleb said, not unkindly. Ida looked at the stone. She cared about whether things were true, not whether they looked perfect. A beat. "It's true. It says what it says." Caleb looked at the stone for another moment. Then he stepped back. Rosie had put a small bunch of dried grass in front of the stone. She'd carried it all the way up the ridge in her fist, very deliberately, because she had seen someone put flowers on a grave once and understood the principle even if the material was seasonal. Nobody told her it was wrong. It wasn't wrong. Spring came to the valley the way it always came, indifferently, on its own schedule, without reference to whether you needed it or not. The contamination in the North Creek continued to clear. By mid-spring, the water testing clear enough that Silas let the cattle drink from the lower reach, standing at the fence and watching them with his hands on the post and an expression that was too complicated to be called relief, though relief was somewhere inside it. The ranch that had been called dying was not dying anymore. It wasn't thriving either. One season of improved water and the absence of an adversary did not undo 2 years of drought damage and financial thinning. There were still lean weeks. The hay shed needed to be rebuilt, and that cost money they had to plan for. The south pasture fence Silas had been meaning to mend since before Evelyn arrived still needed mending. But the ledger was different now. The entries were less desperate, and Silas had stopped looking at it the way a man looks at a document that is sentencing him. She'd had a hand in some of that, not through any particular brilliance, but through the application of the same thing she'd always had: attention. Attention to what was being wasted and what could be salvaged. Attention to what the land could do if you worked with it instead of around it. Attention to the children and what each of them needed, which was not the same thing for any 2 of them. She was not always right. She made mistakes that were sometimes small and sometimes not. She miscalculated the seed order and had to go back to the feed store twice in 1 week, which cost them money and her pride in proportion to how much she disliked being wrong. She was short with Teddy one evening when she was exhausted, and he'd come to her with a question that required more patience than she had left. And she saw his face close the way children's faces close when an adult disappoints them. And she found him later and told him she'd been tired and short and that it wasn't his fault and that she was sorry, and he said okay in the way that meant he was going to think about it for several days before fully deciding, which was fair. She burned the bread twice in 1 month. The second time, Caleb found her standing at the stove looking at the blackened loaves with the expression of a woman at the end of a long day confronting one thing too many. And without saying anything, he went to the pantry and came back with the flour and started measuring. "I know how to do it," she said. "I know you do," he said. "You showed me." He started mixing. 2 heads is faster. She stood for a moment, then she moved the burned pan aside and made room for him at the counter. They made the bread together, and it was not remarkable bread, but it was edible and made in the company of someone who had decided to help without being asked, which made it something better than bread. Harold Hart came to the ranch in early summer. She saw him ride through the gate and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. Not fear, not anger, not the grief-adjacent thing she'd half expected. It was closer to recognition, the recognition of a chapter you'd already read and didn't need to read again. She didn't go out to meet him. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him tie his horse at the post and look at the house and the barn and the rebuilt hay shed with the new wood still pale against the weathered fence lines. He looked older than she remembered. He looked like a man who had heard what had happened in Mill Haven and in the county, and who had made a calculation about what that meant for the transaction he'd made. Silas met him in the yard. She couldn't hear what was said. She watched Silas's posture, straight, still, no anger in it, but no welcome either. The posture of a man who is being entirely accurate about what this conversation is worth. Harold looked toward the house once. She stepped back from the window. He was gone in 20 minutes. Silas came inside and found her at the table. "He wanted to know if you were all right," Silas said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were fine and that the ranch was doing well and that the children were healthy." He sat down. "He said he was glad." She absorbed this. "Is that what he said or what he was supposed to say?" she asked. Silas thought about it. "Does it matter to you?" She considered that honestly. Did it matter? Did she need it to be real, the glad? Did she need Harold Hart to have actually stood in the yard and felt something genuine about the daughter he had traded for 36 head of cattle? "No," she said after a moment. "Not really." And she meant it, which was different from not caring. She cared. She understood that, sitting at the kitchen table in the house she'd walked into as a stranger and now could not quite remember not knowing. She cared in the way you care about a wound that has healed over. The scar was real, the care was real, but the wound itself was closed, and she was not going to keep pressing on it to see if it still hurt. "He left something," Silas said. He put a small package on the table, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. She didn't recognize it from the outside. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, an old one, daguerreotype, slightly dark, the edges worn. A woman standing in a yard somewhere, with a baby on her hip and an expression that was not a smile but was something. Her mother, before everything had arranged itself into the shape that had produced the daughter Harold Hart would trade away. She looked at it for a long time. She wasn't sure if Harold had meant it as apology or explanation, or just as a thing he thought she should have. She was not going to write him a letter asking, some questions you leave unasked, not because you can't ask them, but because the answer doesn't change anything that needs changing. She put the photograph on the kitchen shelf next to her grandmother's cedar sewing kit. Two things from before, both real, both hers. By late summer, Evelyn Boone had been at the ranch for 8 months. 8 months was not a long time. She was aware of that. She was 20 years old and had been traded for cattle and had walked into a broken household and stayed, and 8 months was the length of that staying so far. And there were going to be years of staying after it, and none of them were going to be simple or uncomplicated or free of burned bread and miscalculated seed orders and children who sometimes looked at her with the eyes of people who are still deciding. But something had settled. That was the only word she had for it. Settled. The way land settles after it's been disturbed, finding the stable configuration. Nothing ornate about it, just the natural consequence of weight and time and gravity doing their ordinary work. Rosie had started calling her mama with the casual consistency of a child who has made a decision and moved on. The others hadn't followed. She didn't expect them to, didn't need them to. Caleb called her Evelyn, which was how she'd introduced herself and which felt correct for where they were. Ida called her nothing, which was also Ida's relationship with most formality. May had developed the habit of bringing her things, an interesting rock, a piece of torn cloth that had a pattern she thought Evelyn would like, a question about something she'd been thinking about, in the particular way that was May's version of affection, which was not soft but was real. Teddy, one evening in July, had come to sit beside her on the porch and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "I think you're good at staying," and then gone back inside before she could respond, which was entirely Teddy. She thought about what he'd said for days after. Good at staying. She wasn't sure it was a skill exactly. She wasn't sure she'd chosen it in the way you choose skills. She'd stayed because leaving required a reason strong enough to justify it, and she'd never found one. She'd stayed because Rosie had crawled out from under the kitchen table on the first night and because the bread needed making, and because Clara Boone had written everything down in careful dated journals and deserved to have it matter. She'd stayed because Caleb had packed the journals without being told, because Ida had watched the creek for a year and knew what wrong looked like, because Teddy had put his back against the wagon side to be Rosie's barrier on a dark, frightening ride. She'd stayed because some things are worth the staying. That September evening, she sat on the porch with the sun going down behind the ridge and the ranch around her doing the settling sounds it did at the end of the day. The horses, the fence line tick and creak, the particular silence of the north pasture that was different now that the water was coming right again. And Silas came and sat beside her in the other chair, and they didn't say anything for a while. He reached over and took her hand, the burned one. He held it carefully, aware of the scar, not avoiding it. She looked at their hands and thought about a morning in a land office where her father hadn't looked at her, and a man had looked at her once to assess her usefulness and looked away. She thought about what that morning had produced. All of this. The flawed, difficult, incomplete, still recovering all of this. She thought about Clara's stone on the north ridge with the imperfect engraving and the dried grass that Rosie replaced every time they went up there, a new small fist of whatever was growing. She thought about the woman she'd never met who had written everything down so carefully, who had known someone needed to know why if something happened, and she thought, someone knew. It counted. You did that, and it counted. The sun finished going down. Inside, she could hear May telling Caleb he was wrong about something with the cheerful certainty of a person who rarely considers the alternative. She could hear Caleb's response, which was too low to make out, but had the rhythm of someone choosing not to argue, which from Caleb was its own kind of progress. She could hear Teddy's voice, and then Rosie's laugh. The particular laugh she had, sudden and complete, that always sounded like it surprised her. Silas's thumb moved across the back of her hand. Once. Just that. She was 19 when her father traded her for cattle. She was 20 now, and the girl who had stood in the land office watching her father count livestock had done what that girl always did. She had looked at what was in front of her and decided what needed doing and done it, imperfectly, stubbornly, without much grace and without much expectation of thanks. She had not saved anyone. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind. Silas had fought his own fight. Caleb had made his own decision. Clara had done the work that made everything else possible. Ruth Halverson had found her courage late and brought it anyway. Ida had watched the creek for a year on her own. These were not things Evelyn had produced. They were things she had found, already existing, waiting for someone to recognize them. What she had done was stay in the room, keep her eyes open, refuse the story everyone else had already written for her. The story about a girl too big and too plain and too inconvenient, traded away like a broken plow, destined to collapse under the weight of someone else's problem. She had refused that story not with speeches or declarations, but with bread and rain barrels, and a cast-iron skillet, and 7 journals read 3 times, and a letter to a federal clerk about property recovery law. It wasn't the story anyone would have written for her. It was hers. The porch held them both in the cooling evening air, and the ranch that had been dying wasn't dying anymore. And the children inside were arguing about something that didn't matter and would be forgotten by morning, and the North Creek was running cleaner every week, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything.